final leg of Doctor Who Series 11, as today we'll be taking a look at the penultimate story of the series, which is of course It Takes You Away, as written by Ed Hime. Of course this is episode 9 of the series, meaning that we only have the series finale to go, which is in fact airing this Sunday. So we are basically at the very end of Doctor Who Series 11 already, and I think that it is fair to say that so far it has certainly been a rather large mixed bag of adventures. Of course we've had some absolutely brilliant highs in there, but also at the same time, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we've had some rather bad lows in there as well. I think that the general overall opinion of Doctor Who Series 11 is that it has been a mixed bag. It has certainly been very experimental to see what works with the audience interaction, but also at the same time something that we knew when even going into Doctor Who Series 11 before the episodes actually aired, is that this series is going to split the audience, and it is going to have some people that will absolutely love it. Supposedly there'll be some people that absolutely hate it as well. I think that this story is certainly a very good example of that, and I must admit it is fair to say that I came out of the first viewing absolutely hating the story. I didn't like it whatsoever. I honestly thought that it was around the same level as the Saranga conundrum. I thought that it was low, I thought that it was quite dull. However, I wanted to give the story the benefit of the doubt, much like how I did with the Saranga conundrum, and watch it again and also watch it a third time at certain aspects of the story just to make sure that I definitely got the actual episode. And then of course I reached a conclusion that kind of respects the story for what it does. I think that it is fair to say that this episode is certainly one of the more out there stories of Doctor Who Series 11, and Ed Hime has certainly contributed something to the series that is generally visually interesting, but also at the same time rather scientific and different, and is certainly something that I would relate to more of the Stephen Moffat era, as opposed to what we have seen throughout this series so far. So I do certainly respect him for that. However, I do think the delivery and execution was just a little bit off, which I am of course going to be discussing throughout this review. So now that is out of the way, taking a look at the casting and credits for this story, generally first of all the behind the scenes. Of course, as I was saying, this episode is written by Ed Hime, so a newcomer to Doctor Who once again, which is brilliant. It's nice to have some variety in there. And I think that it's very clear that this is Ed Hime's first contribution to Doctor Who, because it does feel very fresh and very different. Of course, this episode is directed by Jamie Childs, who is somebody who has in fact directed The Woman Who Fell to Earth, and I can't remember what other story of this series. I do know that he did direct a second one, however. I want to say Kablam, but I think I might be wrong with that, but I have generally liked his directing so far this series. This episode is much different in, say, comparison to The Woman Who Fell to Earth, because that was very much a contemporary urban setting. This is something that is more a barren landscape of Norway. Of course, not very many people, there's a few sheep and a few mountains, and there's quite a lot of nice visual moments throughout this story, but also at the same time it does feel very secluded and very different in style. So yeah, big thumbs up for the directing for this episode. The script editor is Nina Mativa, I do believe you pronounce her second name as, and it is produced by Nikki Wilson. The executive producers, as per usual, are Chris Chibnall, Matt Stevens and Sam Hoyle, and the incidental music has in fact been composed by Segan Akinola. So generally overall for the actual production of this episode, I must say it is in fact rather nice. It does look very high quality and a very nice budget, but also at the same time I think that it is quite clear that this episode may have had less focus around it when it comes to it visually, as opposed to other episodes in this season that certainly seem to be a little bit more exciting. I kind of feel like at this point of the series the budget was almost running low a little bit. Now moving on from that and taking a look at the Doctor for this story, of course as per usual Jodie Whittaker, much like the previous episodes I reviewed, such as Demons of the Punjab and Kablam. I think there is certainly an interesting side to the 13th Doctor that is seen throughout this story. It kind of feels a little bit more like the 13th Doctor that we've seen in The Woman Who Fell to Earth, that is a little bit more eccentric and quirky and very much like she's different from everybody else. She doesn't fit within that human setting, and I think there are some absolutely brilliant one-liners throughout this story. Some of my personal favourites will be where she says that the universe is impersonating kind of his dead wife. I thought that was quite funny. It was quite deadpan as well. She delivered it in such a way that wasn't really relevant to the context. This is your wife, yes she's dead. But she's in fact going to deliver that line in a rather funny, emotionless way. I think it was quite nice, and it would be nice to see more of that in the future episodes, maybe throughout Doctor Who Series 12. But I do think that this version of the 13th Doctor was a little bit more like the 10th Doctor or the 11th Doctor, where she's very intelligent, she knows what's going on, and also at the same time she explains explains her thought processes out loud. Of course, there is that moment with Yaz later on in the story where she realises the Solitract and where they are, and kind of the bubble universe that they are in, and kind of explaining that, and all of the idea that her granny came up with, that theory. I thought that was very nice, the way that she explained it, and once again was more harking back to the other new series Doctors. So I do maybe think that this episode's seen a rather doctorly side to the 13th Doctor, but also at the same time I felt like there was something missing. But I think that generally Jodie did do a rather nice job, and I am certainly enjoying her as the 13th Doctor. I just want to see a more consistent character throughout her later episodes, especially in Doctor Who Series 12, as I've discussed previously in my other episode reviews. Then moving on to the companions for this episode, once again I'm going to start with Tosin Cole as Ryan Sinclair, as I kind of feel like in the first act of this story he was rather unlikable. Of course he's got that rather negative past when it comes to his father, of course him being abandoned by his father and leaving him to only be cared for by his mother, so I do understand the complete negativity behind fatherly figures, and the fact that when Ryan actually meets the blind girl in the story, Hunna, he is of course rather negative, saying that her father has probably just up sticks and left her. I thought that was rather unusual and a little bit uncomfortable as well. I think that certainly throughout the first act of this story, Ryan was almost unlikable. It kind of felt like he was in a mood about something and he just wanted to be grumpy about absolutely everything. However, later on in the story, we do see a side to Ryan that is a little bit more warm. Of course, when he is in fact helping Hunna in the rather unusual void that they are in, of course he needs to aid her and help her get out alive, so good to see him actually separated out from the other companions as well, letting him do his own thing. But also at the same time, I did think that that first scene in the opening act of this story just felt very unlikable and cold, and I didn't particularly like the character. So if he actually ended up being killed this story, I wouldn't really care, simply because in the first act of the episode he was a bit of a horrible human. Then moving on to Mandip Gill, of course, who plays Yasmin Khan. Once again throughout this story she had a few nice moments in the first act, which is a little bit of an unusual comparison to Ryan. I really loved the scene where she first met Hunna in the story, where she was of course using her police skills in order to actually talk to her, go down to her level. There was that wonderful line that she says she wants to play with her hope and kind of what she likes positively in order to make her feel better about the situation. I really liked that. I love the fact that she is using her police training throughout her adventures with the 13th Doctor. Of course, previously when we've seen her in her actual career and job was of course in The Woman Who Fell to Earth, and after that story we kind of seen absolutely nothing of that. Of course there was a few references throughout Rosa where she did that absolutely wonderful crime scene diagram type thing. Certainly want to see more of that throughout Series 11, which it is unfortunate that hasn't been used, but it's nice to see it returning in this story, and I certainly would like to see it used more once again throughout Series 12 if she actually gets out alive, which I'm pretty sure she probably will. It's also nice to see with Yasmin's character is I kind of feel like there is a more bonding relationship between her and the 13th Doctor. There's quite a lot of moments throughout this story where it is simply just the 13th Doctor and Yaz walking along together, and Ryan and Graham actually fade into the background a little bit. They don't have too much to do and they kind of go off on their own separate adventure, and even when they go into the weird portal thing, it's almost like the 13th Doctor immediately picks Yaz and Graham in order to do that job. So it is almost like she always wants Yaz with her, so it is nice to see them, as I say, bonding, having a little bit of a stronger relationship, as I do feel that once again, if anything was to happen in the series finale, we've not really had that development there in order for me to actually care about her character, but also at the same time actually believe that relationship that she has with the 13th Doctor. And then finally for the companions, moving on to Graham, of course as portrayed by Bradley Walsh. In this story we have some excellent moments with him. I am going to delve in straight at the very end of this story where we have of course Sharon D. Clarke returning as Grace. Not really too much to say about her in this story, simply because it was the universe kind of acting as the dead character. But yeah, I did love the scene with him. It was very believable, the way that you could actually see the emotions in his face. However, he wasn't crying or anything like that. It was almost shock and disgust and kind of blended into one, and almost that idea of mistakes and regret almost sort of coming to the forefront. And as well, what I really liked is the fact that it was revealed that he blamed himself for her death, and that is something that once again I'm really hoping that what I think will happen in the series finale doesn't happen, because of course in this episode we did have that development with Graham in episode 9, just before the finale, meaning that we naturally care about him a little bit more than the other characters. Could that have been done on purpose? And then finally, at the end of this story, we had Ryan calling him Grandad. So pretty much all of those components are in there now to make the viewer sort of care about him, and of course kill him off at the end of the series, which is something a lot of people have predicted. I've mentioned it in the earlier reviews, and I just hope that doesn't happen, because out of all of the characters of the companions, I like him the most, and I think it's fair to say that the others have been fairly underdeveloped when it's came to him. So yeah, I just don't want to see him die, and I really hope that he doesn't, because it would be a very big mistake. Briefly taking a look at the other characters for this story, I'm going to talk about Eleanor Walwork, who does of course play Hunna or Hin, or whatever you want to pronounce her name as. Of course it is Norwegian, so it does differ in pronunciation. Of course she's blind, which it is great to see Doctor Who actually using somebody who is blind in order to benefit the story. I don't think the actual concept of her being blind was really exercised too much throughout this story. Instead she was just like a regular human, which is great, much like how actual blind people are in real life. They try to get on with their lives as per usual, like nothing is different to everybody else. So I do certainly think there is a sense of vulnerability around Han in this story, because of course she is in this house by herself. She has been locked in, as we find out later on, by her father, and I think that she is once again likeable in the later half, but kind of unlikable in the first act of this story. There is certainly that moment where she actually listens out for Ryan and then shuts the door on him in order to knock him out. I actually thought at that point that she might have been the villain, and there would have been a twist in there that it turns out that she's not the vulnerable teenager that we actually think that she is. See, I did really like her throughout this story. However, I didn't particularly care about her as a person too much. It would have been nice to maybe learn a bit more about her, her background, her family. Of course we have her father in this story as well, Christian Rubeck, who plays Eric. He's nice. We don't really have too much to say about him at all, because he didn't have too much development. If anything, he just seemed to be somebody who cared more about his feelings. There's a few references to him going downhill after his wife died, which is a nice reference. Would it be nice to maybe see that explored a little bit more? Of course, we have Kevin Eldon, who plays Ribbons as well, the rather unusual alien creature, which is nice. You know, I don't really have much to say about him with his little light things, which I imagine that if this series actually aired around 2006, we would probably have a little unusual action figure of Ribbons with his little balloon, because he's kind of around the same level as the Hoiks, where he didn't have too much relevance in the actual story, but he would still look kind of cool in the action figure form. He's almost around the same level as Laszlo as well, but I do think that he's nice, you know, he's interesting, but once again, not really too much to say about him. And then finally, of course, as I said earlier, Sharon D. Clarke as Grace O'Brien. It was nice to see her back, not really too much to say about her. And Lisa Stoke also as Trine, who is of course the dead wife. Once again, she was basically a husk throughout this story. She wasn't really much of a character, because of course she was dead, but she didn't really have too much. I didn't relate to her, I didn't really care about her either. It was certainly more around the focus of Grace, which I do kind of understand. So now moving on to the actual narrative and storyline of this episode. As I was saying earlier, it does feel like this story is in fact a little bit more complex to the previous episodes that we've seen so far this series. It is definitely more like the earlier half of the new series of Doctor Who that you would see around, say, 2006 to 2009. It feels like it's more padded, has a lot more technobabble in there, and also feels like it focuses a lot more on that scientific part of the story. Of course, that moment where the Doctor actually discusses the whole idea of the Solar-Trapped universe. Of course, that was all very scientific and technobabble, and it was kind of a whole 5-minute scene dedicated to basically explaining what is going on in the actual story, because I think by that point nobody really knows what is going on. They're just in this rather unusual parallel bubble universe where people who were dead are now alive. So it did certainly raise a lot of questions throughout this story, and I love the moment where Ryan actually realised that the monster voices from the forest was in fact a speaker. I thought that was rather interesting. I think that as well at the same time I was rather shocked at that. It certainly made me think, hang on, what necessarily is going on? It made me feel rather intrigued, and I do think that certainly the reveal of the father actually being somebody who wants to keep his daughter sort of within his house and kind of using the fact that she is blind to his advantage was rather dark and something probably quite real as well. But also at the same time I didn't particularly see it coming on the first viewing. Of course, on the second viewing, I did notice a few references here and there, such as him saying that he put the borders up around the house literally the day before he left. Of course, when you see it the second time round, you do start to pinpoint certain parts of the story together in order to reveal the dad's motives sort of earlier on in the actual episode. So yeah, it is nice that Ed Hime actually did that with this story, because naturally on first viewing you probably won't pick up on that, so it does feel rather intelligent in its approach. But it's a shame that at the end of this story it does feel like it ends rather instantly and could have had a little bit more of a scientific sort of satisfying ending, because this one's certainly a bit of a dud when it comes to the ending climax. Good to talk about the Mole Man now, because the Mole Man has been annoying me for the entirety of this week. Basically, for those of you that don't actually go on Twitter or any social media, you probably won't know this, but basically the original draft of this story had another creature in there, and there was an image revealed, I do believe, by the person who is actually playing the Mole Bat creature, and he's basically this tall alien character with a big snout, and he looked rather unusual, very much like Slender Man or something like that. It naturally looked very creepy. I would have loved to actually see it within the episode itself. Of course, we don't know how much of a part it did, of course, play in the story. Some people have suggested that it is almost the king or the queen of the skin-eating bats in the actual story, which were nice, certainly added a lot of threat to the episode as well. And I loved the CGI of when Ribbons got attacked by the sort of creatures, and you could actually see the moths crawling out of his eye if you looked very carefully. I thought that was rather grim and nicely actually presented in this story. But it is very clear that when they go to this alien void landscape that I do believe is called the Anti-Zone, apparently, thanks notes for that, but the Anti-Zone, it's clear there is something missing from it, and it is very obvious that that thing that is missing is of course the bat creature, and it would have been great to see that throughout the story, just to add an additional threat to make the episode look a little bit more interesting and cool, because I certainly think around the midpoint of this story I was looking at my watch and I was waiting for the episode to end, simply because it did have a little bit of a lull in the middle where nothing really too much was going on. Discussing the actual Solar Tract itself, it is a rather unusual entity force, kind of. It reminds me a little bit of a Big Finish story to some extent, where it has like the essence or something like that. This is basically a bubble universe that wants to be a part of the real universe, and it wants to try and coax people in on the real universe in order to create that bond and that relationship, which is all nice, it's interesting, quite scientific and quite complex. I love the idea of the Anti-Zone. It made it feel a little bit like the Death Zone kind of to somewhere, because it was like that bridge between the two to keep the alien foes within the inside, and it did feel rather deadly. However, as I say, it's a shame that that wasn't used a little bit more, and we could have had more aliens and creatures in there. But yeah, the Anti-Zone is a little bit of an unusual character. It is of course called the Solar Tract, which I do believe is in fact, I did do a little bit of googling, and I also seen somebody on social media, on Twitter to be exact, actually said that Solar Tract is a urinary infection tablet, so you know, that's nice, isn't it? So that's what the alien for this story is named after. But yeah, I'm going to discuss the frog, because the frog is basically the Solar Tract and has certainly divided opinion for this story. Originally, when it happened, I hated it even more, because on the first viewing I just thought, can this episode get any more dull? And then the stupid frog appears that is voiced by Grace, which I thought was ridiculous. However, it's a little bit of a hellbent scenario, I'm going to refer to it as, where it only appeared in the actual story. I wrote down the exact timing. It appeared between 41 minutes and 44 minutes, so only around 3 minutes of this story actually featured the frog itself, and I do question, are those 3 minutes enough to actually ruin the actual story? And in conclusion, for me, I think not. I think that it's generally something that is a mistake, and it's not very good, and it certainly doesn't deliver a threat or anything like that, and it could have certainly been presented in a better manner. However, those 3 minutes for me necessarily didn't detract from my overall opinion of the actual story. I would still give it around maybe a 6 or 7 out of 10, and the frog doesn't really lower that in any way, because I think by this point in the story, the damage has kind of already been done. To be quite honest, when we went to the rather unusual white area, I was half expecting the White Guardian to pop up, not a frog on a white kitchen chair. But you know, that's something that they decided to do. They get a little bit of fun and giggles into the actual story, and this episode certainly offered that, I guess. Of course, the fact that we have the Solitract as the main monster for this story does of course once again mean that we don't necessarily have an actual proper monster. Last week we did have the Morax, which was nearly on the way to being a proper monster, however it still didn't have the actual threat that a normal Doctor Who monster would have. Meaning that once again this episode is a little bit lacking on the monster front, which is just the same reoccurring thing throughout the entirety of Doctor Who Series 11 so far. I do not understand why we do not have proper actual villains. I was actually researching for this review, and I think that it says a lot. This is the Doctor Who website's actual monster page of every character that has been a monster or deemed a monster in Doctor Who for quite a long time. So taking a look at the 12th Doctor era, we have Poirot, let's forget about him. We have suit zombie people, which, yeah, fair, those are monsters. The monks are monsters, the ice warriors are monsters. The Eaters of Light, that was actually a monster, kind of underplayed though. Monday's Inside Man, obviously a monster. The Masters, or Missy, obviously a villain. And then we get to Doctor Who Series 11, and we have Tim Shaw, or whatever you want to pronounce his name as. He's not really much of a villain, he's certainly very underplayed, but he's the most villainy villain that we've got so far this series. Then we've got Rag Things from the Ghost Monument, not a monster. We've got a man that looks like he's meant to be from a Boohoo advertisement, or Vogue, not a monster again. Mutant Spiders, not a monster. Let's not even get onto the Pating, because I bloody hate it. The Theragians from Demons of the Punjab, we actually know that they are monsters. They used to be, but they aren't anymore. The Postmen, they're not monsters, they're just robots with malfunctioning programming. Then we have the Morax, the most monstery monster that we've got this series, and then we've got the aptly named creatures from the Anti-Zone. So not even the bloody creature from this story is actually referenced as a monster. Even just going back to Doctor Who Series 9, the Sandmen from Sleep No More were monsters, the Zygons were, the Veil was obviously a monster. Had so many monsters in the past few years. However, Series 11 just lacks a lot of monsters that are actually evil. So yeah, even though we were meant to see the break from Daleks and Cybermen as a positive thing, we kind of were hoping it will be a positive thing, providing they actually replace them with other monsters and not a man from a Vogue advert and a bloody Pating. It's a very unusual scenario, because I do think with the majority of Doctor Who in the new series, you normally find yourself saying this episode could have done with an extra 15 minutes or 20 minutes in order to pad out the characters and give more development to the actual plot. However, in this story, I find myself almost saying this almost feels like a short story that should be around 25 minutes long, and if anything, it doesn't actually use the entirety of the running time to its full potential. It kind of feels like it has very little to go on, and this is stretched out for the whole entirety of the story. The actual concept is lovely. I love the idea of the Norwegian location to start with. I love the fact that they are in the solitary house in the middle of nowhere, but they're just bears and sheep. It makes the characters on the inside of the house feel very vulnerable. And that whole idea of the Doctor and her companions sort of walking up to this what looks like uninhabited house to see what is going on, what's made this house look how it does, to find out that there is something darker underneath is very nice. I love that. I love the idea of the Anti-Zone. It kind of reflected a little bit of an alternative dimension. It kind of felt like, to me, a bit like the Upside Down from Stranger Things, or it's kind of being like a reflection of reality itself. It looked like a world that has been war-torn. It looked like a hellish place to be. And then of course we had the alien in there as well. Up until that point in the story, I loved absolutely everything. And then of course we had the new dimension in there as well, which I thought was interesting, but that was the point of the story where I kind of feel was underdeveloped. And we brought Sharon Clark in there as well, which was nice. As I said, to give it a little bit more opportunity for Graham to have a bit more development. And what I did also like is you could quite obviously tell that he was affected by the consequence of the story. The fact he wasn't with the other companions throughout the final of this episode where they were saying goodbye to everybody, but instead he was just by himself, reflecting literally into the actual lake itself. I thought that was nice. It showed that he was once again vulnerable, affected, very much at loss because his wife is of course dead. However, at the same time, it didn't really develop that. I kind of feel like Ryan had that little scene at the end where he called him Grandad and he's there for him, but the episode episode could have easily gone on for another 10 minutes, or at least eaten into the story a few 10 minutes at least, in order to actually show that loss and show how it's affected him, but instead it just almost cut off halfway, and we didn't see that, and presumably the rest of that conversation will happen off screen, which was definitely once again a missed opportunity. So overall for Doctor Who Series 11, Episode 9, which is of course entitled It Takes You Away, it is ironic because this episode in fact doesn't really take me away whatsoever. It certainly had a lot of potential, but also at the same time it certainly underestimated itself and it could have done a lot more. I think that one of the main things I can summarise for this story is there is a wonderful moment where the 13th Doctor in fact says that the wife in the story is furniture with a pulse, which is also a quote that I could actually use to refer to the majority of the companions throughout the entirety of this series. There has been a number of moments where I have referred to both Ryan and Yaz as a piece of furniture in the background setting of the actual story, and I think that that pretty much summarises this actual episode, along with the idea that the Solar Tract is actually named after a tablet that is used for a urinary tract infection. So yeah, that's It Takes You Away. Some potential, under-exercised, but still a rather interesting story. Not necessarily the worst of the season, but certainly for me, probably around a 6 out of 10, maybe something like that. But by no means is it worse than the Saranga Conundrum, because quite frankly, I don't think anything will beat that as the worst episode of the series. So yeah, that is this episode. Next up we're going to be having this series finale, which is of course a rather interesting looking episode. In the Next Time trailer we have the Doctor saying, "I recognise that voice," so I'm just hoping, fingers crossed, that that is actually a villain that we've seen before Doctor Who Series 11, because quite frankly, if it's anybody that we have seen in Series 11 so far, there's not really been anybody that I've actually cared about that much to actually see return in order to have that shock horror effect. So who knows, maybe Chris Chibnall might bring back a classic villain for a big final surprise or something like that. I just hope that this time next week I am not sat in this chair in front of this camera discussing the loss of Graham and how much of a bad choice that is for the future of the 13th Doctor era, which I really hope that doesn't happen, but I've got a strong feeling it probably will. Of course, it doesn't mean anything that when Chris Chibnall says that the companions, along with Graham and the 13th Doctor, are going to be in the New Year special, because of course Doctor Who is a time-travelling programme. So thank you for watching this review, I hope you've enjoyed it. What is your general opinion of It Takes You Away? Why not leave it in the description below? What did you like and what did you dislike? Would you have liked to see the mole character in this story for a bit more? I know that I certainly would have. And what are your predictions for the final episode of this series? Of course, it is quite a big coincidence that there is 9 distress calls, and there has so far been 9 episodes this season. Could that be relevant, or could it just be a loose little reference in there that means absolutely nothing whatsoever? We can just predict away, but I guess I'll see you all next week for that review, along with more Doctor Who episode reviews and product reviews and Big Finish reviews and all sorts coming in the future. So yeah, thank you for watching. I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.